I spent half my childhood growing up in Washington State. Naturally, I was drawn to the volcanoes of the Cascade Range, particularly Mount St. Helens. Who wouldn't be fascinated by that level of destruction from a serene peak that flattens the landscape in minutes and turns day to night for cities hundreds of miles away? The nightmarish images seem too fantastic to be real, and yet the end result is undeniably silence-inducing, almost provoking a holy reverence for the aftermath. So when I went out looking for volcano films, I found one starring Pierce Brosnan set in the Cascades. And the rest is history. Dante's Peak was part of the mid to late 90s disaster craze, which included films like Twister, Titanic, Godzilla, and of course Volcano, which came out the same year as Dante's Peak and starred Tommy Lee Jones. Taking advantage of CGI, the genre thrived on the new ways to deliver stunning visuals. Most weren't that great, but the spectacle was really all that was needed to draw people in. The project started with screenwriter Leslie Boehm, who debated with a colleague for some time as to whether a volcano film was a good or bad idea. Once the pen was put to paper and it started to get some traction, director Roger Donaldson was offered the picture. What most people didn't know about Donaldson was that he was an amateur geologist and at one point considered it for a career. So it was his passion about the subject matter that drove him to say yes. Pierce Brosnan was a suggestion from Donaldson, who was nervous about offering it to him given his newfound status as the fifth James Bond. Thankfully, Pierce had it in his contract with Eon Productions that he could do a couple of other films in between Bond, so after his enormous success with GoldenEye, he was eager to do something different. Linda Hamilton was another unconventional choice in the wake of Terminator 2's success, as most people recognized her as playing tougher characters. But like with Pierce, she was eager for some variety. Filming commenced in the spring of 1996 and went smoothly. Word got out that another big-budget picture centering on volcanoes was set to release in 1997, so post-production was accelerated so that one could release earlier. Dante's Peak released on February 7th, 1997, with Volcano coming out the following April. Reviews were harsh for both films, though Dante's Peak got the shorter end of the stick. Surprisingly, though, this was a case where audiences felt differently, as not only did Dante's Peak make more money, but it is still talked about fondly with some people, and there are several scientific articles praising the film for being one of the most accurate volcano films to date. 4 years after losing his girlfriend to a volcanic eruption in Colombia, Dr. Harry Dalton is a workaholic finally trying to take his first vacation in years. However, his boss, Dr. Paul Dreyfus, calls him back in to check on some activity coming from Dante's Peak, a volcano in the Cascades that hasn't erupted for thousands of years. Skeptical, but doing his due diligence, Harry heads to the local town and meets with Mayor Rachel Wando, who is leading the town to a prosperous future. After taking some readings and coming across 2 dead bodies, Harry becomes alarmed enough to call in the cavalry. Once in town, Paul calls for caution, pointing to both lack of scientific evidence and past experience for his actions. He censors Harry for being rash and tells him to leave town. However, Harry can't shake his gut feeling that something is stirring deep beneath the mountain. At the same time, he strikes up a relationship with Rachel, thus now having a personal reason for wanting to see this through. Little does the town know that Harry is correct, and they are about to see their homes devastated by a cataclysm that only the geological forces of Earth can produce. As I alluded to in the beginning, this film appeals to me for exactly 2 reasons. It stars my favorite James Bond actor, and it's trying to be a scientifically accurate depiction of a Cascade volcano eruption. Some liberties are taken for dramatic purposes, and I'd be lying if I said these characters are the most captivating you'll see from 90s disaster films, but I put this squarely in the category of guilty pleasure. It's a simple and effective film. Perhaps a touch overly familiar and safe with the usual one man versus almost everyone else conflict, but you're getting exactly what you expect, and it's hard to be disappointed because of that. The most amazing thing about this film to me is that it feels relatively timeless. The effects surprisingly hold up to this day with a few exceptions. There are a few moments of horror done well, and the simplicity of the characters gives way to a relatable humanity that other films would be envious of. In short, this is a movie I'd say is overlooked and underappreciated. It's no masterpiece of the genre, but it's above average and still knows how to deliver the thrills of a natural disaster in a great way. When most people think of volcanoes, they think of the lava-flowing firebomb kind of colorful destruction. That is certainly a common type, but cascade volcanoes tend to go a different route. They go for pyroclastic clouds of destruction, with superheated artifacts that either burn or flatten anything in their path. They issue lahars, which are mud flows from remnants of the mountain that are essentially super fast rivers of debris and often cause the most damage from eruptions. Cataclysmic cascade eruptions are not slow-moving torrents of lava. They are the closest things to a cloud of death, almost like a biblical plague. It's an awe-inspiring, bone-chilling event. There are different levels of this, and the 1980 eruption of Mount St. Helens was actually one of the smaller events from the mountain's history, but regardless of size, it's not to be taken lightly. It makes perfect sense to use modern filmmaking technology to recreate this chaos for the big screen, and it's the main reason to see the movie. You'll likely never be this close to an eruption of this size and survive. There are a few inaccuracies, of course, though I'm not a scientist and couldn't tell you all of them. Though I do know enough to know that having both pyroclastic clouds and lava flows in the same eruption isn't typical, as those come from two different processes within volcanoes. Also, the intensity of the earthquakes and the level of destruction of the buildings during the first explosion isn't really a thing. Obviously, the biggest liberty taken is with the truck driving over lava. Lava tends to be around 1700 degrees Fahrenheit, so the truck would likely explode pretty quickly. But generally, the movie doesn't have to exaggerate much to get its thrills. Several aspects of the eruption process are accurate, especially the warning signs in the first half, and sometimes a volcano can go from 0 to 60 that quickly. My estimation is that for Hollywood films, Dante's Peak is far closer to the reality of a VEI 5 eruption than most of the others. Of course, you have to sit through about an hour of film before you get to much of that, and both Pierce and Linda do an admirable job of carrying the picture. The film does follow the structure of Jaws, where the first half is more focused on the town and their reaction, and the second half is the more action-heavy stuff. Pierce and Linda don't have an electric chemistry, but I buy their attraction to each other, even if I would have liked for a couple of more exchanges about them talking about their personal lives. But I get it, you don't want to bog the movie down too much, and most viewers are only going to care about the spectacle. But they do enough to make me interested in their relationship, and I think Pierce in particular does a great job with the kids. Harry's an outsider who's never had kids, but he feels far more comfortable relating to them than even he might have known, making him consider a possible future with the family. Still, Pierce and Linda aren't the only ones pulling their weight. The late Charles Hallahan does a fine job as Paul Dreyfus. He plays the role of the experienced, more cautious scientist that perhaps delays things until a little too late to save many lives, but I actually see him as far more sympathetic than a lot of others that play this role. Looking at it from his detached perspective, Paul is absolutely right that they haven't seen enough to determine anything, and he has logical reasons for thinking that way. I do think he throws Harry under the bus a little too hard during the city council meeting, but I generally sympathize with his stance, and it's not like he's not taking the situation seriously. Once he's convinced, he does as much as Harry to get the appropriate people alerted. I do feel something at his death, and that's more than I can say for a lot of analogous characters. I also think the group of scientists are effective. Donaldson was adamant about making sure the audience could tell them apart from each other. I don't always remember their names, but I don't get them confused with each other either. Terry in particular, with his kick it if it doesn't work attitude, is probably my favorite. Two of them are actors of note. Greg is played by Grant Heslov, who has become known as a producer working with George Clooney on several projects, as well as winning the Best Picture Oscar on Argo, a terrific Ben Affleck film if you've not checked that out yet. Stan is played by Ty Ma, who is well known for doing 2 Rush Hour films as well as playing Mulan's father in the 2020 Disney live-action remake. The two kids do fine here and aren't as annoying as they could have been. Sadly, I think Grandma Ruth is the weak link here, at least as a character. I find her so unlikable and stubborn beyond sympathy. Her story is based on that of Harry Truman, a real-life victim of the 1980 Mount St. Helens eruption, so it's not like she's unrealistic, It's that she's more two-dimensional than I would like for her death scene to really hit home. That said, her jumping out of the boat to save the family is perhaps the most terrifying part of the film. Elizabeth Hoffman really sells the pain in that scene. If there's one moment that's going to give you nightmare fuel, it's that one. The production earns aces almost all around in my book. The film was shot in Wallace, an old mining town in northern Idaho, which I've been to a couple of times, and yes, it still really does look like it does in the film, minus the mountain which was added in post. For more general movie buffs, Wallace was the birthplace of Lana Turner and was also a shooting location for Heaven's Gate, a 1980 Western that became notorious for its significantly large budget and poor box office return, which contributed to United Artists being sold to MGM. Hence why Octopussy is the first Bond film to open with the MGM logo. The music is also very good, with the major themes being provided by James Newton Howard. Howard was set to score the film but ran into time constraints, so John Frizzell picked up the baton. The main theme has always stayed with me. It's an eerily beautiful piece that's still ominous and, in my mind, perfectly captures the feelings I have when I see a volcano at rest. It's peaceful now, but it could turn into chaos when it feels like it, and you can only marvel at its level of destruction. I even went out and bought the 2021 limited release expanded album, which is what you're hearing from now, so that should tell you how much I like the score. As I've said several times before, the effects are the star of the show, and they are astounding. Combining miniatures, composite shots, and a few bits of computer enhancement, there are some truly memorable shots and moments throughout, and you don't spend the film squirming at the obvious rubbery CGI. In fact, a couple of moments of the flowing lava are my only real hangups. The pyroclastic clouds look terrific. You wouldn't know that the dam collapsing and the trucks going over the bridge were miniatures if you hadn't seen the behind-the-scenes footage, and I never once questioned the look of the ash. Digital Domain was the primary effects company behind this film, which was founded by James Cameron. They started out doing films like True Lies and Apollo 13, and quickly moved on to doing Titanic and Armageddon. Their reputation is well earned, and knowing that Dante's Peak was one of their earliest efforts leaves me gobsmacked. I do have a few minor nitpicks. This film constantly references other famous volcanic eruptions beyond Mount St. Helens, which was the primary inspiration for the film. I do appreciate educating the audience on these events, as this was the first time I learned about Mammoth Mountain, but it does begin to feel forced at times, like the Pompeii comparison at the beginning. Also, Mount St. Helens is a logical choice to base this eruption on, given how it captured the imagination of so many people. However, I kind of resist how obvious the comparison is, at least to me, given that certain shots are of that mountain. The scene inside the crater is shot partly at the real lava dome inside St. Helens crater, and the mountain in the back behind Harry and Terry is Mount Adams, a sister volcano roughly 30 to 40 miles to the east of St. Helens. Though the most annoying cameo is at the end, when the helicopter flies off into the distance and we pan over to see the new version of the mountain. It's so obviously St. Helens that it feels like it's hammering that point in. I admit these are probably just me things, as I'm very familiar with the mountain, but anyone who has seen a few pictures of the mountain would know what they were looking at here. Finally, in the scene with the boat and the acid, I have a couple of questions. How come Pierce's hand isn't as burned as Grandma's legs are? Also, where did all the falling ash go that we saw just minutes before? I get why they didn't include it, as it would obscure the actors' faces and make the shooting more difficult, but it did stick out to me this last viewing. I wish I had more to say about this film, given how many times I've seen it. However, Dante's Peak isn't that interested in drawing up layered characters, interesting thematic notions, or anything like that. It knows why you are there, and it respectfully asks you to wait while it develops its characters and story so that it can sustain your interest once the mayhem starts. But once it does, it's worth the price of admission, and it's admirable how well it gets you to care about these characters so that the film can survive repeat viewings. That's a common problem I have with disaster films. Once you've seen the showstopper, you realize that's about all it has to offer, and that the characters are too close to cardboard cutouts to make you want to rewatch more than a few scenes of destruction. Dante's Peak doesn't attempt to be pretentious with how rich the other elements are, and that's pretty refreshing in a genre plagued with mediocre efforts. The cast works with what they have, and they don't attempt to go beyond the boundaries that are set. Roger Donaldson is adept at handling both the humanity and technical sides without losing my interest at any time. And it's a film that, while I don't recommend it as being strong enough to justify the obsession I had with it when I was a kid, I do recommend it as a solid entry in its own right and worthy of multiple viewings. If you've not seen it in a while, go out and give it another go. You'll have fun with the 2 hours it takes to unfold and make you have a greater appreciation for the natural forces that shaped our planet. If there's one thing this film does right, it's capturing the awesome and visceral chaos that a volcano can produce, and that's an achievement worthy of being put on film.